Hello, welcome to the second session in the series of Ancient Art, Neolithic Art. In the Paleolithic cave paintings of Europe, realistic representations of animals are seen in great profusion. Their form and function are convincingly explained by relating them with the sympathetic magic ritual of the primitive hunters. When the Paleolithic came to a close, an entirely different style in art began to embrace the whole of the following period called the Neolithic or the New Stone Age, which starts from about 8000 BC. However, this change did not take place all of a sudden, but a result of a transformation extended over many thousands of years. By many respects, the New Stone Age was a revolution indeed. The food gathering and hunting life of the Paleolithic were replaced by agriculture and cattle breeding in the Neolithic. The Paleolithic man was only dependent on nature's gift for food. He did not produce but consumed. The Neolithic man, through domestication of animals and plants, produced food for himself. It made him lead settled and organized life. This revolutionary change had brought about a new life world in which the Paleolithic representation of animals, the way it appeared, was found no longer meaningful. The Neolithic man expressed an extreme indifference towards the mimetic realism. It is the abstract forms shaped out of his abstract concepts of life and death that concerned the Neolithic man most. Before we analyze its specific formal features and their significance, it is equally important to dwell upon the beautiful rock paintings of Mesolithic, the transitional phase between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. Look at these rock paintings. They belong to the region known as Iberian Levant, the Mediterranean coast facing Africa. They have more connection with Africa than with the Paleolithic Europe. These works open up a new episode in the history of art, and it did not confine itself to the Mesolithic age, but continued in the Neolithic age too, and further until the 19th century among the Bushmen in Africa with a miraculous prolongation. At the first sight of these works, we are struck with the stylization of the figures. They are flat and with elongated silhouettes in red or black. The artist no longer makes an effort to capture the illusion of the real, whereas he makes a conscious attempt to suppress the realistic rendering which was the hallmark of the Paleolithic painting. Still, it would be hard to say that they are devoid of life. They are full of life, but with astonishing movement which at a considerable measure was lacking in the Paleolithic paintings. Moreover, in contrast to the animal representations of the previous epoch, Iberian Levant art shows conspicuous preference for human figures, archers in hunting or battle or man in different daily activities. Similarly, but in a different manner, stylized and schematized human figures and animals also hail from the Mesolithic rock paintings of India. These paintings show different communal life. In all these instances, it seems that the artist was not content with recording an image with outline or contour, unlike the Paleolithic artist whose main concern was contour, which was stressed with definite and bold outline. There are some more features to be noted. The Iberian and Indian rock paintings show no fascination for detailed description of a form, but their preoccupation was to increase mobility, dynamic movement, and clarity. Everything is vividly visible amidst continuous motion. To accentuate the sense of motion, the artist had resorted to a considerable degree of exaggeration without falling prey to affectation. A runner's legs are set impossibly far apart and disproportionately long. The evocative accent of the visual language thereby brings home a striking sensation. As Rene observes, the image to its suggestive force is progressively summarized in a sign. It evolves in a kind of a shorthand. One can see, for example, animals simplified to a horizontal line mounted to little sticks, the number of which, on the other side, increases beyond all verisimilitude, the better to stress the ability to run. In the same way, the warrior becomes a vertical stroke, broken up by cross strokes for his arms, which are also multiplied in relation to the force attributed to him. The impetus that shaped this representational scheme is man's predisposition to simplification, his incessant move towards abstraction, which in a latent manner had already manifested itself along with the realistic imageries of the Paleolithic paintings. The cave paintings are not exact and truthful copies of the model in its every detail. Rather, they are rendered with the essential features required to lend them an illusion of the real. As Rene observes in his brilliant study, the need to simplify first appears when an art is born. Inability to follow nature in all her unexpectedness leads to the substitution of equivalent shapes. Art tries next to overcome this inability and reaches a point of balance where the methods of execution render a satisfactory account of what the eye sees. Then we have realism. Once realism is achieved, it sustains for a period and gradually begins to refine on itself. This inherent urge leads to stylization. In this continuous process, art expresses its tendency to substitute simple forms for complex shapes and structures. Man has a natural inclination to look for simple, clear, and comfortable order in the midst of the complex, chaotic, and the disordered life. We can see this universal tendency as a determining force in the making of the Iberian art of the Mesolithic age. At the same time, it also speaks of a strong aesthetic urge that comes forth by now towards schematic and conventional signs. The images are only meant to suggest the object, not to reproduce it. Instead of recording a visual reality, art now tries to hold fast the idea, the concept, the inner substance of the things, as observed by Arnold Hauser. Hence, for the Iberian Levant rock painter, the fleeting movement of the runner is more important than the exact proportion, dimension, and physiognomic detail of the body. That makes the Mesolithic paintings under reference a distinctive departure in the history of art. It is beyond doubt that Paleolithic cave paintings, which appear in the inaccessible and darkest recesses of the caves, were not produced to satisfy any sort of aesthetic delight. This has been proved by various other factors too. As mentioned earlier, the Iberian Levantine artist does not seem to be concerned with representation of animal, but man in his different attitudes and postures. Among them, the scenes of hunting and battling come to preoccupy his imagination. It is its narrative, its storytelling through the visuals, and its aesthetic sensation that bring about its specific formal features as something different from the reality. Unlike the Paleolithic paintings, the Mesolithic rock paintings and engravings, also found at different parts of the globe, are seen at the entrance of the cave or on the rock surfaces open to daylight. It clearly indicates that, being dissociated with the magic rituals as that of the Paleolithic hunters, the hunting and battling scenes of the Mesolithic paintings are produced for their own sake as something to be looked at for aesthetic pleasure, which inevitably presupposes a spectator. Art thus gradually becomes conscious of its own value. Apart from this, there might have been another interest and need for commemorating experiences. As Reneke puts it, in a society which begins to organize and stabilize itself, the main concern is to pass on to the future the principal activities of communal life, sometimes even to give permanence to the memory of an important action. Previously, the ritual act of a person making the drawing was what mattered most, and apparently no one worried much about looking at his work afterwards. Succeeding generations did not hesitate to superimpose drawings until they finally merged in an illegible network. Whatever it might be, this predisposition for simplification moves further and further until it reaches a point beyond which it cannot move. In its optimum point of simplification, the form or shape of an object turns to be an abstract motif which at a great measure fails to be identified with the model from which it was derived. The Neolithic art, which is largely characterized by geometrical or abstract motifs, comes to represent the final stage in this evolution. As it is seen in the stylized human figures and animals painted on the walls of the cave of La Graka and the Mesolithic human figures of Tantrimale in Sri Lanka and of Bhimbedka in India. The drawings merely indicate the figures by 2 or 3 simple lines. Sometimes it merely depends upon semicircles and triangles to indicate human body. In such an abbreviated method, man is distinguished by the addition of weapons and woman by 2 hemispheres for the breast. These schematic representations are later to become more abstract in the Neolithic. Geometrical abstraction is also seen pervasively used in the Neolithic potteries at various sites in European and Eastern cultures. Gordon Childe says that they all looked alike. As one of the most distinguished scholars on the prehistory, Abbe Henry Breuil says, during the Upper Paleolithic, geometric decoration existed side by side with and independent of the great naturalistic art. The elements of this original stylized art greatly enriched ornamental art from the beginning of the Magdalenian. A large number of Magdalenian bone blades exhibit very rich decorations which are obtained by grouping motifs of this origin: ellipses, zigzag, chevrons and florons. Breuil continues to say, one of the most certain origins of the geometrical decoration of many Neolithic vases comes from the first pots, often supported in baskets, which were destroyed by firing and whose weaving left its traces on the belly. When the basket was superseded, the zigzags of its imprints were initiated by hand out of sheer force of habit. In the long course of its evolution, the ornamentalization based on the technical origin, as Henry Breuil observed, possibly had refined on itself by combining, separating, regrouping the decorative motifs into different patterns. However, an important question pertaining to this context is not about the formation and transformation of the abstract geometrical patterns, but about the fact why the Neolithic was so much fascinated with the geometric or abstract forms over many thousands of years by abandoning the sensually beautiful paintings of the previous epoch. What might have been the basic idea embedded deep in the Neolithic mind, which had widely accepted and retained the abstract forms, which later tend to be reduced to pictographs in certain cases. To seek explanation to this problem, we have to shift our focus to the distinct perspective of the Neolithic culture, marked by the change from food gathering to food producing economy. With the introduction of agriculture, the Neolithic began to develop a distinct conception of the nature. In spite of the fact that the Neolithic man became the producer of food for himself, he was not completely free from the shackles of nature. His survival on agriculture still considerably remained at the mercy of nature. His dependence on good and bad weather, on rain and sunshine, on flood and drought, on fertility and infertility of the earth, generated in him the idea of visible and invisible powers of earth issuing blessings and curses. He became aware of unknown and mysterious forces beyond his control. Thus, the world is divided into two halves. This is the phase of animism, of spirit worships, of belief in the survival of the soul and the cult of the dead, says Arnold Hauser. Animism, a new development in the New Stone Age, was rooted in the dualistic aspects of reality and super-reality, a visible phenomenal world and an invisible world of spirit, a mortal body and an immortal soul. The burial customs and rites of the New Stone Age make it clear that this period was conceived the soul as a different entity from the body. That is why the Neolithic art preferred stylized and idealized superworld to a mere day-to-day reality of the Paleolithic. It marks the beginning of intellectualization in art through the introduction of signs and symbols, abstraction and abbreviation. It suppressed the previous visual experiences of empirical reality by thought and interpretation, by accentuation and exaggeration, by distortion and denaturalization. Again, says Hauser. Art by now no longer continued to be a reflection of the sensory world, but of an idea, of a vision. The more abstract the idea, the more abstract the art forms. Artist as a passive imitator of the nature in the Paleolithic is replaced by the artist as a creative man in the Neolithic. This drastic change has its parallel in the Neolithic art, conspicuously differing from the Paleolithic hunters' unaltered visual experience of the natural surroundings. Having discussed so far the abstract forms in painting and pottery as a predominating artistic manifestation of the Neolithic, we would be surprised to see some sculptures recently unearthed at a Neolithic site at Jericho near Jordan in Palestine. Like the one we can see in this image, they are realistically rendered sculptures dated around 7000 BC. In point of fact, they are not sculptures in the real sense of the term, but real human skulls on which the faces are reconstructed with tinted plaster with cowrie shells for the eyes. However, it shows a remarkable skill in reconstructing the lifelikeness with subtle and precise modeling. Its fine gradation of planes and ridges and the relationship of flesh and bone show that it was meticulously executed by a well-trained professional hand. Having the skulls turned back into sculptural life, they are found displayed above ground, while the rest of the body was buried beneath the floor of house. Most probably, they belonged to worship of ancestors whose beneficent presence was thus assured. The Jericho huts mentioned earlier helps to confirm the Neolithic belief in spirit or soul, which was located in the hut to be perpetuated beyond the death of the body by replacing it into an enduring body of sculpture. It can also be called a sculpturally beautiful trap designed to attract the spirit back into its original dwelling place. The whole idea behind it vividly reflects the Neolithic man's demand for retaining the memory of family and clan, which together brought him a sense of tradition. This remarkable phenomenon also lent him a distinct quality of human culture derived from agriculture, which necessitated a settled life. As the skull spirit was well protected, People in the Neolithic Jericho lived in the stone houses within a fortified town protected by walls of strong masonry construction. Roughly 1,000 years later to Jericho, in Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, had Neolithic occupation. Its inhabitants lived in houses built of mud bricks and timber on plaster-covered walls. We encounter there the earliest paintings on a man-made surface. One of them shows a beautiful delineation in red of a hunter or dancer in a dynamic movement. Another one portrays a hunting scene with quite a few tiny human figures surrounding an enormous animal, perhaps a huge bull or stag. It recalls the Mesolithic hunting scenes, which presumably retains its hold in a lesser degree of its preoccupation. Apart from this, Çatalhöyük is striking with a landscape depiction. A town under the danger of a volcanic eruption is shown in a conventionalized wall painting. The terrifying aspect of the volcano, which held the inhabitants in endless tension, might have exerted its pressure on the artist. The dots on the twin cones representing the blobs of lava juxtaposed with the densely packed rectangles of the houses bring in such expression implicitly present. Such a volcanic view is still visible today from Çatalhöyük. Due to various reasons, the Paleolithic sites of Europe no longer continued to be the places of occupation for succeeding epochs. The Neolithic culture first emerged at various places in the Near East were much older than those in Europe. Thus, Neolithic Europe never reached the level of social organization that produced the masonry architecture of Jericho or the dense urban community of Çatalhöyük. Rather, in the European Neolithic centers, we confront with various monumental stone structures. The vertically erected stone structures are called megalithic because they are of surprisingly huge stone blocks merely placed upon one another. Their basic function was religious, not aesthetic, rooted again in the belief in the spirit or soul. The single stone erected upright, called menhir, like the one at Kyrgios, or the circularly arranged stone henges of Salisbury, was intended to provide a permanent abode for the dead person. They are the prototype of a historical monument. At the same time, they also bear constructive impulses which were later to develop into architecture. Architecture means something higher than ordinary texture, meaning construction or building. Although these megalithic monuments do not enclose space, their awe-inspiring superhuman air by all means make them be called the beginning of architecture. It should also be noted that even though they are the simple stone blocks of the physical world familiar to us, by transposing them through miraculous human labor, they were immediately endowed with meaning which they did not have of their own and were thus transformed into symbols. An abstract form gets meaning out of human touch as much the abstract shapes come to acquire symbolic meaning as in the painting of the New Stone Age. Let us summarize what we have discussed in this session. Realistic representation of animal was the main imagery in the Paleolithic period. Mesolithic period, immediately following the Paleolithic, manifested a perceptible transition with the paintings of hunting and battling scenes on the rocks. The Neolithic further moved towards abstraction, both in painting and sculpture. Abstraction in art first appears in Neolithic is more associated with the Neolithic man's abstract idea of life after death. Here too, interestingly, we find art is interconnected with life. Explain the distinct style of Mesolithic paintings of various sites. How do you explain the Neolithic tendency towards abstraction in thought and art? Trace the beginning of architecture in the Neolithic period. What is the form and content of megaliths of the Neolithic period? Hope you have got a clear entry to look at the art of the Neolithic period. We can meet again in the next session on Egyptian art, which marks altogether a new beginning. Thank you.